Welcome to the latest episode of 5 on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. Thanks for joining us on your favorite podcast app, on Apple Podcasts, on Android, Spotify, or the 5 Reasons YouTube channel. Also, check out Off the Floor. That's our Discord server, $2.99 per month. Get off of Twitter during election season. You don't need all that stuff. Just talk Heat with us and with other Heat fans. Link is right here in the description. We got a ton of stuff coming up. We're going to be adding to Off the Floor, adding to it. So you're going to want to make sure you're there. This is going to be the one-source shop for all Heat information. Also, check out Prize Picks, legal again in the state of Florida. Use that code 5. Get that Caleb Williams weekly prop. Use the code 5. You put down $5. They give you $50 to play right away. No strings attached, no catch, no nothing. Prize Picks, again, pair anywhere from 2 to 4 players together in the state of Florida. That's your lineup, and you can win big. Again, prizepicks.com. Use the code 5, F-I-V-E. And now, today's episode.
Down the Biscayne. Yikes. 5 on the floor. Ride for my dogs. Where here's the thing. You can check the score. Hustle hard, couple scars, wearing bubble frogs. Just like Butler said, you in trouble, y'all. Kept the floor playing. Got it all banned. Y'all seen the block. Stop with one hand. And Pat we trust. It's power, have the guts. We're here to bring the heat. Y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to 5 on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, and Alex Toledo, plus others from the 5 Reasons Sports Network.
All right, welcome back to 5 on the Floor. Here's today's floor plan. I'm Ethan Skolnick. You can follow me at Ethan J. Skolnick and at 5 Reasons Sports. I got Greg Sylvander. You can follow him at Greg Sylvander. Check out recent episodes. Most recent one, Brady and I broke down Zach Lowe's comments, where Zach has, who is, by the way, one of the NBA media members that I most respect. I know a lot of us in the network most respect, but he has done some whiplash stuff on the Heat in recent years. He went from bleakest outlook in the league, right, to gushing with praise about them during the course of the Jimmy Butler era. And then he said during this free agency period that, and again, I know some Heat fans agree with this, so I get it, but that, you know, essentially the Heat didn't do anything and the most disappointing offseason to now all of a sudden they have a rock solid rotation when nothing's really changed other than some of these young players have popped. So then he went through what he thought would be the Heat's preferred starting lineup coming out of training camp. And I will say both Brady and I don't agree with it. Let me ask you this before we get into today's topic, which is going to take us a completely different direction. Do you think that the Heat's preferred starting lineup, in other words, the one that they would like to come together during camp, would be Bam, Jaquez, Butler, Hero, Rozier?
I mean, I can make cases for it, and I won't do so in long fashion because we got another topic to get to. But if Jaime pops to the degree that he has to start, and Terry and Tyler are playing well enough offensively, creating that actually can work and they can win games. I mean, of course, I think that they'd love for that to happen, but I don't think that that's necessarily all the expectations in play. I think that ideally one of those two guards would come off the bench.
My argument is I think they would like that to ultimately emerge as their closing lineup because it does mean that Hero and Rozier were playable together and that Jaquez was giving you enough defense to not have to play Highsmith there and was giving you enough shooting to not have to have Duncan in the starting lineup. But I don't know about starting lineup because to me, coming out of camp, like that would mean to me that Jovic didn't pop because they know what they have in Jaquez at this point, don't they? Like they kind of know, like, I mean, worst case scenario, Jaime's going to be a 14-point scorer off the bench. Don't we? And then probably maybe even average more than that because he's going to start for Jimmy some nights when Jimmy doesn't play. So it's kind of like, to me, Jaquez is kind of a known quantity at this point with upside to pop, but like Jovic is the guy. It's like, all right, wait a second. Like if he looks so good next to him or Ware for that matter, although I don't think that's going to happen, but if either of them, like, then okay, you're set with Jaquez.
It raises
coming
the
off
ceiling.
bench. Correct. That's the way I would view it. But anyway, Zach knows a lot more about basketball than me. But when Brady was on my side, or close on my side, I was like, all right, wait a second. Now I'm going in there. I'm not just going in there with a slingshot. I got something a little stronger to go into this duel here. All right. What we're going to talk about today, though, a little more serious. Both Greg and I follow the Dolphins. I cover them from time to time. I was there the other night. unfortunately. I'll say this, okay? People know me who know my history know that I actually started by covering the Dolphins in South Florida. That was the first team I covered as a full-time number one beat writer. I was the backup covering on the Heat and the Panthers, and I got lucky in 96 because both teams were in the playoffs and the Panthers made their run to the Cup final, which until this past season was the best, obviously, the Panthers had ever done. So I'm not a jinx in that regard. So I covered those two teams as a backup. A little bit of trivia here. Her career went a little better than mine. Rachel Alexander, now Rachel Nichols, she was the backup for the Sun Sentinel. I was the backup for the Palm Beach Post. So we were basically the two young at the time, the two young writers who were getting, sort of broken in on these two teams. But my first team that I covered full time was the Dolphins, 97, 98, 99, before I switched to the Heat, and then over time covered some Dolphins, but have primarily covered the Heat since. But I still cover the Dolphins. I still go to some Sunday games, and we have a big Dolphins presence on our network. We have 3 Yards Per Carry, All Dolphins, which are 2 of the top Dolphins podcasts. We have Pulse of Fins Nation, Inside Leverage Show. Guys are going to get upset at me, but Final Yard, Yard Prep, all kinds of yards, on the YouTube channel. So make sure you check out all our Dolphins content. I was at the game the other night, and I will say this, okay? I was at the game they won the playoffs. Last playoff game they won December 30th, 2000. I've been in a lot of games since. That was the most depressing game that I've ever attended while being around the Miami Dolphins. And that includes the one that I thought could never get topped, which was two of them in 2002. One in Denver where they won to go to 5-1. A Lindo Mare field goal, 24-22 in the snow. I was there, and we went downstairs, and Fiedler, Gadsden, and Chambers were all in the training room. Jay wouldn't play for 6 weeks. Chambers' career was never the same because he got lit up by Kanoy Kennedy, and Aranda Gadsden hurt his thumb, and his career with the Dolphins was never the same. And then I was also there in New England when that season they actually put themselves back in position, even after the Ray Lucas debacle, to put themselves in the playoffs, and then somehow dropped a game in New England that I still have no idea how they did it, except that I approached Rick Spielman on the food line. He was the GM of the Dolphins at the time, and congratulated him for the Ricky Williams trade and making the playoffs. And I think Rick never spoke to me after that day again because.
Were you in Jacksonville for Marino's last game?
No, I was not. 99, I was not. People are asking me about that. No, I was not there for 62-7. That probably would have been the number one. Of course, the Dolphins found their next starting quarterback, Jay Fiedler, because he came in relief and threw a touchdown pass against the Dolphins for Jacksonville that day. No, I was not there, but I was there in that New England game where literally everything. Like Alindo Mari kicked the ball out of bounds. They threw for Chambers 3 times against Terrell Buckley. They stopped giving the ball to Ricky Williams, even though he had like 3 million yards that day. And that was one of the worst locker rooms I've ever been in. And I will just say this. This was the worst. This past one was the worst. The fact that you lose to a rival that you can't get past the past few years, and the quarterback who, like the worst case scenario, like he plays all 17 games last year so that you extend him because he got through the season healthy, and then it's not even on a play that the offensive line caused. He's literally trying to get an extra yard, and he lowers himself instead of sliding into, of all people, Damar Hamlin's heart. Like literally, like the it's just
the script.
I mean, the two body parts that have been talked about most of the NFL over the past 2 years have been Damar Hamlin's heart and Tua's head, and those things collide, and Tua's out. So the reason we want to talk about this on a Heat podcast is because the Heat have dealt with these kind of situations before. And they had really 2, I wouldn't say builds necessarily, because they were both tweaks of builds. Okay. They were builds that they were taking in a different direction. But they had both of those undermined by unforeseen ailments to 2 core players, 2 of the guys that we had in the top 5 in Miami Heat history. Alonzo Mourning was 4 on our list, and Chris Bosh was 5 on our list. And they dealt with this twice. And so we're going to go back through the circumstances of this, little Greg, and how they handled it and how this may play out for the Dolphins, but mostly sort of how the Heat recovered from these situations, because I actually think that it's going to be more difficult for the Dolphins to recover if Tua is not playing again. I know he says he doesn't want to retire, but if he's never the same again. So let's go to the first one. and I know this is close to your heart because, and this is why I wanted to bring you on, because you're the only one in this podcast, in our little podcast, other than Sean, who may be able to relate to some of this. But the Alonzo Mourning one, I think people forget where Zoe was in his career at that point. He had just come off a season where he was number 2 in MVP voting. Is that correct? I believe he was. So
Yes,
Carmel, right?
You're right.
His offense had finally caught up to his defense, and at that point he had finally kind of overcome the questions about his demeanor on the court, because everything with him, there was a lot of Draymond in him early. Like, he was getting technicals and kind of getting out of it. He'd get in his head, but that had kind of stopped, and he'd replaced Timmy as the engine of that team. And then he goes to the Olympics. He has the birth of a child.
They reshaped the whole roster around him. Don't forget that.
And that's the key part. And that's why I say this was like a variation of a build. They had decided to get him the help. Like everything we've talked about with Jimmy, they had done with Zoe. Like, they finally said, okay, the PJ Mash thing, it's run its course. And they knew it was over. And they went out and they tried to get Grant Hill or Tracy McGrady, not in that order. Pat actually flew up to Orlando to get them to change their minds. And
McGrady was almost done. They reported it on the damn radio. Like, back in the day, that's where you got your Woj bombs came via radio updates, and that is what they reported. I remember it clear as day that McGrady in a 3-team deal would end up in Miami, and then it never happened.
It never happened. And actually, there was even a chance that Duncan was going to end up, if you recall, in Orlando at that time. Like, Orlando was, and Heat fans better get used to this because this may happen again. Or that's the last time Orlando was like a serious threat to the Heat in terms of attracting players. Okay. And they got both McGrady and Hill. In Hill's case, it turned out to be a good thing for the Heat because he got injured against the Heat in that playoff series. Hurt his ankle, was never really the same player. But McGrady, obviously, who knows if he would have gotten hurt with Miami. But McGrady was like a superstar. You know, he was, people were talking about him on Kobe's level. You know, I mean, that's kind of where he was at. And they ended up, because they didn't get him, they got Eddie Jones, Brian Grant came, and Anthony Mason came. They reshaped the team around Zoe. And I remember I was being at FAU, and I was actually sitting next to the great Barry Jackson, who at the time was not FLA Sports Buzz, but we were there and waiting for Zoe to show up and not seeing him. And he had failed this physical. And he ended up missing 69 games. And they went 42-27 with Mason as their kind of lead guy. And then, not their lead guy, but he played an all-star season. Then he came back. They went 8-5. Everything kind of sort of got messed up. And then they got blown out in the playoff series, right? And then, of course, then there was another incident where Zoe got missed time again, right? And then ended up leaving, coming back. All right. Then there's a Chris Bosh situation where it was both around the All-Star breaks. It was like 15 and 16. But the key thing with that one was, I remember when that news dropped, was the day they acquired Dragic.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the worst possible timing. Like, they had reshaped it. So in both cases, okay, they had a Zoe Timmy build with Mash and PJ. They made a conscious decision. We are going to give Zoe a better chance here with this group, made major moves. Then it was, okay, we're past the LeBron era now. We're going to give Chris and Dwayne a better chance, and we're going to go out and get Dragic. And we were talking about pick and pops and all that kind of stuff. And literally on that same day was the reporting that Chris was in the hospital. And then again, the next year, we were at the All-Star game, and I remember getting the word there about that, and that was, I believe, in Toronto. And then Chris ultimately never ended up playing again, and it became this big issue where Chris was angry at the organization. His family actually distributed T-shirts in Toronto, which they wore in the arena. It was something like Free Chris or Let Chris Play or something along those lines. They made a big issue of it, and the organization stood firm, and he was in the locker room. And Chris, one of the nicest guys, one of my 5 favorite all-time interviews, it was totally weird. We'd be in the locker room, and he would be there reading a book, but we were not allowed to approach him. This is somebody that we'd covered for 4 or 5 years. We'd gotten to know Chris a little bit. It was just tension. It was a strange situation. Ultimately, the organization, though, did the right thing. And I said so at the time. They saved him from himself because of the blood clots. He could have died on the court. He saved him from himself. And essentially, though, there was sort of, I mean, there's a motive for the organization too, personally, but there were liability issues involved in this. And that's, Greg, where I want to get to this. Before we're going to get to the Tua part of this, is in both of those situations, how do you think the Heat recovered from both of those? Looking back at them, it took a long time in both cases.
Correct. And that's kind of where I wanted to go initially, is just to say, when you make plans and the universe laughs and all of a sudden you have to pivot and you can't plan for some of that stuff that took place, I think what we learned in Heat history is that that's followed generally by a relatively lean period in Heat history. It may not last forever, but I think if you looked at directly, I mean, all of a sudden we blinked and LaFonso Ellis and Rod Strickland were on the Heat and they were winning 20, something games. And they had to kind of, until they drafted Karan, it kind of felt that they were in a weird place. And then after the Bosh situation, you kind of went through that period where they signed everyone to the 1-year contracts and then they went on the run, but you didn't think that was really a good team. They invested in them. It kind of felt like a lean situation as well. So I think that the big takeaway for me is that when these kind of things pop up that you can't plan for with such integral parts of your team, and as we kind of, weave in the Dolphins with this, Tua being at the most important position, I think is very reminiscent of the way that Bosh and Alonzo were in some of the more important positions within those structures of those teams, how it just completely throws you for a loop. I don't know how you get back from this, but in Miami's case, it took a while. And I think that is whether it was that you had to wait for other contracts to run their course, or the player was just so important to that team, like Goran and Chris Bosh, that was supposed to be a deadly pick and roll duo. Mm-hmm. And, they just never got to see it happen. And I think that's the main takeaway, is that you can't really expect the team to be able to overcome something like this in one off season.
Well, you can, and that's why I've got to give the Dolphins a little bit of grace here, although I didn't on a recent episode of Starting Five on the channel, because I'm like, all right, you knew Tua was susceptible, and you had Skylar Thompson as your only other quarterback on the roster, and I want to get into the Dolphins part of this as we go forward, but there really is no way to prepare for. I mean, the NBA is different in the sense that one or two guys can make a bigger difference than the NFL, unless it's the quarterback. And then there is a parallel, right? Because when you're talking about Zoe, who was a superstar level player, Zoe was a top 5 player in the league at that time. And Chris Bosh may not have been top 5, but he wasn't far off. I mean, they paid him like he was top 10 at that stage. And it also was a way to kind of transition with Dwayne. And I always wonder about this. Like, yes, Dwayne left because he was offended about the money, right? And about paying Whiteside early and chasing Durant and not taking care of him and telling him to wait. But I do wonder, like, if Chris, like, let's say in 15-16, because they'd already gone through this in 15 with Dwayne, where finally they patched it, got Pat and Henry Thomas, the agent, out of the way. The Arisons gave him $20 million for 1 year and basically just tabled it, right? Just they kicked the can down the road to the next year. And then next year it all blew up, right? When Hassan became a free agent and all that. But it blew up in part too, because first thing, like, let's say that team, let's say Chris is healthy in 15-16. Like, let's say the blood clot does not reoccur and he comes back. And let's even say Hassan was healthy for that play. They probably beat Toronto. Mm-hmm. And I always believed they had a chance against that Cleveland team. They had given LeBron fits. Okay. I mean, they had blowout wins against that Cleveland team, if you recall. Like, LeBron could not win in Miami after he left. And I always wonder, like, okay, how does Dwayne look at the situation? Does he look at it differently if they win that series against Toronto and then beat Cleveland and they're in the finals? Does Dwayne end up leaving that team in 16? Do the Heat let Dwayne leave if they're coming off a finals appearance, right? I think that looks different. And I remember I literally walked with Dwayne to the bus in Toronto. And I wrote a column for the Herald, like, this looks like it could be it. Like, Dwayne's body language was like, and I think part of it was, I think he had a feeling he wasn't going to get paid the way he wanted to get paid, but also it was like, okay, I mean, they made their run. They had purple shirt guy. They got past Charlotte, but they ultimately fell short. And Chris's status was in doubt. I mean, that was a big part of it. So we talk about it in both cases. Now, the Heat, then they needed Dwayne to come back, essentially make it okay for Jimmy to come. So you waited like Chris played his last game like February of 16. Okay. And then Jimmy arrived in the summer of 19. You really can make the argument that that was a 3.5 year,
lean period.
Period. Right. And in Zoe's case, when Zoe went out the first time, and then again had some dispute with the organization, ended up moving on, coming out. It really wasn't until until first Shaq arrived in 2004, right? Yeah, the 2003-2004 season, which was fun because Dwayne was drafted and Karan and Lamar and all that. But it wasn't really until Shaq arrived and then Zoe came back to help fortify that team that things were patched up there. And so it takes a while, and there really is no way to prepare for it. And you just try to be as protected as you can. And in Chris's case, they knew that there was a possibility of reoccurrence. But what I want to get to on the other side of this is what the responsibility is for the team with a player. Because I don't think that the Heat ever honestly got enough credit for the way they handled the Bosh situation. Because that was not easy. Okay. It was not easy at all. And I also don't think they necessarily got enough credit for the way that they handled Zoe kind of coming at them after everything they'd done for him during that period of time. And now to have a situation where Zoe's back in the organization and everybody's in everybody's good graces. So before we do that, do you want to mention a great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network? Our friends over at Water Cleanup of Florida. You can find them at WCUFL.com. That's WCUFL.com. 561-408-7835. That's 561-408-7835. All the way from the first leak through the end of the process, through the cleanup. Water Cleanup of Florida can walk you through it. Again, this is your one-stop water and mold cleanup shop based in Boca Raton, but they service the entire Tri-County area, and 105-star reviews on Google. If they can't do the job, they will tell you. They're just really good people. Again, and huge Miami Heat fans as well, big supporters of the network. They're the people to go to. So Water Cleanup of Florida, the flooding, this is going to rain all week in Fort Lauderdale, so I wouldn't be surprised. I hate to say it, but I mean, this Broward Boulevard ends up looking like a lake at a certain point. So check it out. Could end up in your house or business. Water Cleanup of Florida, WCUFL.com. If you've got the schmutz,
they got the guts.
Let me ask you this as we get into Tua here. Were you okay with what the organization was doing with Chris Bosh, not allowing him to play in 16 as a fan?
Mm-hmm. I thought it was the right move. I thought that in both cases with Alonzo, them having to make that decision. Like, I still remember that press conference when they said he was not going to play, and then the Bosh situation. You kind of knew that Bosh wanted to get back on the court, and I guess there were some doctors that agreed with him, because I don't think he would have gone with no medical opinion and swung in that direction. So there had to be somebody that was giving him some information he trusted, where he wanted to push that envelope. But the Heat stood firm, and I thought it was the right thing to do. Part of it, though, truthfully, like when you really strip down all of the human side of it, which I tried not to do, because I think that that's the most important part of it, though, was you started to think about, like, if he's never going to play again, there were Heat fans that said you can't get him back on the court because his contract will eventually be removed from the salary cap situation. Like, I hate to bring it to that place. It's gross, like from a human perspective, to even go there. But from a team building perspective, you kind of needed that relief if he wasn't going to play again or be the same. And so I thought that they handled it the right way. I think in retrospect, it looks like they did. And I think also then having to go through those 3 to 4 year lean periods, even though that sucks, I just think that it kind of shows that they did put the player first. And I think that that's the big question mark, because the NFL, at least this is my perspective, that the NFL is a little bit of a different culture than the NBA. And I feel like that there could just be maybe a little bit more lenience towards letting him back on the field if that's what he really wants to do. I mean, I listened to guys over the weekend talk about how many concussions they had. And, you had one guy on the panel, I think it could have been Teddy Bruschi or someone like that, who said he had like 7 concussions. So, like, who knows how many is too many, and what the the team feels versus the doctors and how much Tua is going to push. So that's where this gets interesting for me, because I think the Heat did handle it right by putting their foot down. And I just wonder in the NFL if that's going to be, particularly with all the guaranteed money that he just received, like how they're going to let that play out if he's willing to play again. And doctors say that, that there's no reason for him to retire, which I know even people like Barry Jackson have tweeted that he's heard similar from, sources with medical opinions, etc.
Well, I think you hit on a lot of important things there. The first thing is that the culture is different in the NFL than the NBA. I also think that you have to look at what was happening in the NBA too. Eric Spoelstra was on the court when he was the closest person to Hank Gathers when Hank Gathers died. And for those who don't remember that, Hank Gathers was the Loyola Marymount star who playing with Bo Kimball in the tournament. And Spo was playing for University of Portland, and Hank Gathers clutched his heart and died on the court. And Hank Gathers was going to be a first-round pick, and Spoelstra was the closest person to him. And I remember us writing about all that at the time, because there's a real there was a precedent to this, okay, where something could happen to Chris that, literally the head coach of the Heat had seen happen right in front of him. But you mentioned the part about this being sort of some of this being gross, and it just is. The reality of this is gross, but it is the reality that a lot of this does come down to money and liability. It's just and also to the desires of a particular team. Tua is going to want to play. The player wants to play typically, okay. Particularly if you're as driven, and I heard Ryan Clark talking about this, okay. They're just wired differently, particularly in that league, to come back from a hip injury like Tua did, and overcome everything he's had to overcome in terms of sort of the emotional abuse he dealt with from his previous head coach, Brian Flores, and all of that, to get to the level that he got to lead the league in passing yards. You have to essentially be psycho about playing this sport. You just have to be, right? And he's going to want to play, but there is also financial reasons to want to play. And Barry did, as usual, a great job outlining this, but essentially there's insurance, concerns and all of this, and liability concerns from the team's perspective. But additionally, for Tua's perspective, he signed this extension. But if the doctors clear him and he doesn't play, he loses a lot of that money. Now, if they don't clear him, if they say no, so you would think, in most cases, the way a normal person is wired, you're hoping the doctors don't clear you, collect your money and go sit on the beach in Hawaii, right? That's essentially it. He's got a family. He's got, he has a family now, a young family. And he's set for life regardless. But if the doctors clear him, he has or don't clear him. I'm sorry, say you can't play. He has generational wealth then for not having to work for the rest of his life. Okay. Doesn't he have to put the pads on again? But he's not wired like that. And Bosh wasn't wired like that. Bosh was going to get his money. That wasn't really the issue. The issue was he wanted to play basketball, and the people around him wanted him to play basketball, I think even more than he did. I literally, if you move from here, you can see I have a picture with Chris right back there. I remember that entire circumstance. Now he's smiling. He's happy about it. He has peace with the Heat organization. But at the time, he did not. And so I think what this is going to come down to some things that we, I think, as observers, fans, media, can't really understand, because we're not professional athletes who played at that level. We're not playing for our legacy. We're not defined by that level of competition. And, Zoe could have hung it up. Zoe made plenty of money on his first contract. Zoe didn't have to, come back, okay, and then be Shaq's backup.
Exactly.
On his, right? Think of how important that was, okay? Because what Zoe did was incredibly selfless. It changed my entire perception of him. I'll be honest. Zoe was a pain in the ass to cover the first go around. He had a Zoe day. But when Zoe came back, I was like, is he going to accept this? He's going to accept being a backup to Shaq, who'd always demeaned him. Okay. Yeah. Shaq was the number 1 pick in the draft. Zoe was the number 2 pick in that draft.
Icy relationship, the whole career.
It was always icy. And you're coming back to the organization where you essentially set the standard. He made the Heat matter as a player. Pat did as an executive and a coach. But Zoe was, and we talked about that many times. They traded your favorite player, Glenn Rice, to go get him. He was, everybody has stood on Zoe's shoulders. And when I talked to Zoe about this, and at an event this year, he uses that phrase that they stood on our shoulders on Pat, and they did. He's correct. And to come back as a backup, well, look, Dwayne then ended up following suit in what became his organization after Zoe. And not only that, Dwayne, a lot of the charity stuff that Dwayne did, Zoe's Summer Groove, Dwayne picked, remember Zoe and Dwayne ended up co-branding Zoe's Summer Groove with Zoe because Zoe wasn't quite the star anymore. So
he took the cues in the community. Dwayne took his cues from Alonzo in a lot of ways.
Exactly. So Zoe coming, so I give Zoe tremendous credit for all of that. And he didn't have to do any of that. None of it. Like,
so they're all wired different than we are. That's for sure.
They're all wired different. And that's why I want to tie these things together. And so is Bosh. Bosh didn't have to. Bosh ended up making the Hall of Fame. Okay. As did Zoe, both of them, without having to continue playing. Like, Bosh ended up not playing because the Heat weren't going to allow him to do that. The Dodgers weren't going to allow him to do that. And he made the Hall of Fame anyway. Now, Tua's not going to the Hall of Fame, not at this stage, but Tua was the NFL passing leader last year. Like, whatever you think of him as a player and what his limitations are and not winning games in December and January, think of how many quarterbacks there are, okay, or in high school, in youth sports, in college and all that. And Tua Tagovailoa, okay, at 5'11" or whatever it is he is, okay, when he really stands up, was the number one passer in terms of yardage in the NFL. And people are telling him he has to retire. He's not going to do it unless a doctor tells him to. That's it. Unless a doctor tells him you cannot. A team is not going to clear him. And so to close the loop on this may end up being a situation where the only way that Tua doesn't take the field is if the Dolphins, in combination with the doctors, do what the Heat did with Bosh. Right? And that's really the only.
I think that's just a gigantic if. And I don't. There's probably some that will disagree with me and say that the Dolphins will err on the side of caution, but I just have a feeling that if Tua really wants to get out there and play, and a doctor will say it's okay, that even if they have other doctors saying it's not the right move, they may lean in the direction of letting him back on the field. That's just my gut feeling. I could be wrong, but I'll go on record as saying it here.
I agree with you. I think they're going to let him play again. In fact, I think, and it's just a prediction, it's not a report, but I think that they got basically they put him on IR 4 weeks, right? And they got a bye week. So it would be 38 days after the last concussion. So whatever that game is after those 4 games, I expect him to be back on the field. And the only thing I blame the Dolphins for on this, and I did it today, is I think that the calls for him to be back on the field are going to be louder from the public because they did not even come close to protecting themselves at that position.
And I can understand that part of it because the backup, the reserve quarterback situation in totality, not just the backup, but the backup to the backup. It's not.
Well, they don't even have a third guy. Look at the
skill position players that the Dolphins have. You should have had at least some insurance and a contingency plan because you're so good at the skill positions that like you can still have a good season if you have a competent player there. But right now, I don't think that they do.
There was no way for the Heat to prepare for what happened with Zoe or Bosh. There was no way. Like, it's not like you say, okay, go get yourself a backup. And the reality is that they got close. I mean, Anthony Mason was an all-star playing. I don't know who was the center that year, him or Brian Grant. You could say one or the other. But, like, they essentially got all-star play from the guy who slid over to Zoe's spot. They were supposed to be complimentary to Zoe, but they got all-star level play from Grant and Mason that year, which allowed them to go 42-27 before they came back. And, you know, in the 15-16 season, their contingency plan was basically Eric Spoelstra put Luol Deng at the 4. I mean, that was and they got better. That's the reality. They got not in 15, but in 16, they got better. Once Chris went out because the team fit better because Bosh never really fit next to Whiteside. That was always going to be an issue. But with the Dolphins, like they knew like this was a problem. And they've got a former 7th round pick who really has not developed into anything as their only option at quarterback. I'm not saying you were going to get somebody at Tua's level, but it almost seemed like they were afraid to bring in anyone of any quality because they did not want to create a narrative controversy with Tua. But if you believed enough in Tua that you were going to give him almost $200 million, then it doesn't matter who the damn backup is. Bring in somebody solid. And I go back to, not that you're going to have a young Montana situation or Rodgers and Favre. Okay, those are few and far between or all that. But they should have had somebody in there that they at least could try to get through 4 or 5 games with without the fan base going to be freaking out about getting 2 on the field because, honestly, the backup can't play. And not that he can't play at Tua's level, but he can't play that you're looking for guys like Beathard on the street, or can we get Brady out of the booth? Anyway, our final
Ryan
thoughts.
Tannehill's out there.
Well, exactly. He wants a starting job, though, permanently. But I did you hear he was a college receiver? My final thought on this is I just hope that the Dolphins handle it with the care that the Heat did with the Bosh situation.
Agreed. Even if it means that you don't ever get to see this vision of this team with the Dolphins come to fruition. As a Dolphin fan who hasn't seen much winning, and you really wanted to see this through, I hope that they handle it with that type of care, because in retrospect, it actually makes the entire situation feel less gross. I'm using air quotes when you think about that they were in good conscience back then. The Heat were, and I hope the Dolphins are as well.
Yeah. And look, we can talk about the other factors that may have been involved, liability, insurance, all the rest of that stuff that plays into it. And there always is going to be money involved with this. There's always going to be perception involved with this, selling tickets and all of that. I get it's a business, but ultimately whatever the reasons for the decision were, the right decision was made. And the right decision was made, even though they took a lot of shit for it. They did. They took a lot of shit for it. Like that scene in Toronto it'll always be a weird thing to me. You had this guy who was like a pillar of the organization. It was like, you didn't feel like Chris and the Heat were on the same side anymore. And that was just weird. But ultimately then you saw it. They brought him back. They honored him. They put his jersey up in the rafters. He's welcome anytime. And, and they celebrated him when he went to the Hall of Fame. Like it ended the way it should end. And it ended with Chris alive. That's the biggest thing, and not compromised for the rest of his life and by anything that happened on the court after. Okay. And I just hope that the same is the case for Tua. Nobody should be telling him to retire. No fan should be telling him to retire. It's his decision. But I just hope that if the doctors advise that he retires, that the Dolphins at least try to back up that viewpoint in that way. All right. Thanks for joining us. We'll have more Heat content as we go up towards training camp, which of course begins October 1st, media day on September 30th. Good to have Greg back. We'll have Brady and Alex on here on episodes this week as well. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the 5 on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. After all, someone needs to listen to my dad.